Hello, friends. We're back with episode 174 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast. This is the weekly podcast where we talk about the terrific resources and the highlights sections that are being shared, along with much more content in this week's Our Weekly issue. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted you join us from wherever you are around the world. We are in the month of August already, and time has flown by quick. So, of course, I got to buckle up my virtual seatbelt here as we get along the ride to an eventual conference next week. But of course, I need to bring in my awesome co-host, who I never do this alone, of course, because he's joining me here, Mike Thomas. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Eric. I am 6 days until my flight leaves, and I can't be more excited to get to Seattle.
That's right. In fact, yep, as you've heard in the previous episodes, Mike and I will both be at PosiConf in Seattle, which means that usually during our quote-unquote recording time next week, I'll actually be giving a presentation around that time. So you won't be having an episode next week, but nonetheless, we'll make it up to you later in the month. But nonetheless, we've mentioned this before, if you are going to be in the area for PosiConf, please come say hi to us. We're going to be out and about. I'm actually arriving pretty early because I'll be part of the Our Pharma Summit that's happening on Sunday before the conference, and I'll be in one of the workshops for databases, so I'll be around. Mike, you're getting in on Monday, it sounds like. So, yeah, we'll definitely looking forward to connecting with you listeners out there.
Please say hi. Yes.
Awesome stuff. Yeah, and I can't confirm or deny that I have some sticker swag with me. I'm still trying to get stuff together. I still have to pack, so lots of things to bring with me. But good thing we don't have to bring, writing and our weekly issue ourselves. We got a handy curator team that handles that for the project. And speaking of going above and beyond, for the second week in a row, our curator this week is John Calder. He really stepped in to help out with our scheduling for the rest of our curator team. So again, many of you hopefully know this by now. Our weekly is a completely volunteer effort. So anytime we can pitch in and help each other out, it's just so valuable to us. So our curator team always goes above and beyond. So certainly my thanks to John for stepping in. And as always, he has always had tremendous help from our fellow Our Weekly team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your pull requests and suggestions. And yes, it's been great to see the momentum behind, the adoption of the tidymodels ecosystem for many machine learning, prediction, and other pipelines in the modeling space. We've covered numerous segments here in the podcast about some of the recent advancements on the internal tooling that's been happening over the years. And it's always great to see members of the community start to adopt this to their existing workflows, especially in cases where they've had maybe some internal custom solutions, and now they want to see where does tidymodels fit in terms of giving them advantages to constructing their modeling pipelines and what that experience is like. So our first highlight today is doing just that. It comes to us from Mike Mahoney, who is now at the USGS as one of their scientists and biologists, which is the U.S. Geological Survey, for those that are outside of our U.S. circle here. They've been doing some great work in the R community with a lot of their tooling, but in particular, Mike is involved with a very important effort for the New York Forest Carbon Assessment, which in a nutshell is trying to objectively measure the amount of forest coverage within the state of New York and helping predict the changes in this coverage as part of the recent Climate Protection Act that was trying to minimize their use of carbon emissions from obviously fossil fuels and other things like that by the year 2050, I believe. They want like an 85% reduction in that, which means that they're trying to take advantage of what forests and other plants can provide and helping offset some of those decreases. So this summer, they've been working on version 2 of their automation pipeline and modeling pipeline of this assessment, where, again, they've had some internal functions to help with the tuning and creation of these stacked ensembles, but now they want to use the broader ecosystem of tidymodels to kind of bring all that together in one cohesive structure. Now, unfortunately, he can't share the actual data they're using for this ensemble project at this time, but the blog post does a terrific job of taking advantage of publicly available data from actually not far from your neck of the woods, Mike. They're taking advantage of tree canopy data from online sources in the city of Boston from 2019. And the goal of this post is to illustrate very similar to how they're adapting their New York Forest Carbon Assessment by fitting two types of models, the MARS, which is a multivariate adaptive regression splines, as well as gradient boosting modeling, which again, these are highly popular in the machine learning and prediction space. So the first part of the post talks about how he assembles the actual prediction data, the outcome data, which again, I think is very comprehensive. If you're into learning how to obtain these data, Mike definitely has you covered with all the data pre-processing steps, the various packages you need. And lo and behold, once you do some data pre-processing and visualization, you now have a tidy data set with the outcomes of interest that he wants to predict. So with that, now it's time for the model fitting. And so they got a cell values object, which is, again, hosting the outcome data and the prediction data. One little nugget here right off the bat is that just like of anything in R, when you're doing a prediction model, you need to have some kind of formula object to help denote what are the relationship between the outcome and the predictor variables. And there's a handy little function in base R called df2 formula, which I wasn't familiar with, which basically will be intelligent enough to determine if your data set has the outcome variable as the first column, and then the rest of the columns are prediction variables. It'll actually assume that structure, and then you don't have to write like the typical formula syntax of outcome, tilde, and then all the different combinations of predictors. It literally just takes that data as is and builds your formula object right off the bat. So that's another one of those hidden base R nuggets that you see from time to time. It's always great to see those. Now, in the tidymodels ecosystem, there is kind of a stepwise fashion to how to produce these workflows. The first step is to register the recipe, which is kind of going to be the building blocks for the actual fit itself, where you simply feed in the formula and the data set that contains your observations. Simple enough with the recipes package to do that. And then now it's time to fine-tune the model specifications, which again, one of the great things about the tidymodels ecosystem is that it has dedicated packages to help with some of these things. Now, that may not always work well, which we'll get to later on, but he outlines two specifications, one for the GBM model and one for the MARS model, which again, depending on the model type, you may have different sets of parameters to specify. And then throughout that, for many of the parameters where he doesn't know right off the bat what are the best values of, such as like the number of trees or the tree depth and the GBM side of it, tidymodels, of course, lets you tune for those parameters, optimize for those, leveraging the hard hat package and its tune function. But you'll see in the code, it's actually littered throughout this model specification with no arguments. So it's trying to do a lot for you from an abstraction perspective, which again, may or may not be always perfect, but we'll get to that in a little bit. You've got the specification of the model now. Now it's time to set up the workflow, which is again coming from the workflow sets package, where you can put in your recipe as well as your two model specifications and making sure you've got all that integrated together. Gives you this nested data frame back where you can see your two recipes in this case, the information inside, and then once you actually do the prediction, it will capture the results as well. But what Micah's saying high praises of is that a lot of this takes a lot of code back in the days before tidymodels, a lot of things you had to build on the fly. Certainly Max Kuhn had offered the carrot package well before tidymodels. Many people use that to orchestrate their flows. Still, you had to learn the nuances of how to stitch all this together. tidymodels is trying to abstract away a lot of that manual effort to stitch all this together so that you can have fit-for-purpose functions to define all this. So again, we'll come back to the benefits and trade-offs of that in later on. And then once it's ready to go, you've got to now start composing your samples, your resamples of the data, as well as tuning your workflow sets. In other words, finding what are those optimal parameters. So with the workflow map function, which is going to actually take that set of combinations of the recipe and the model fits, you feed in a certain set of metric or parameters such as your space for the grid search, and then also some two arguments that we'll come back to later on, the metrics and the control argument, which is going to help with specifying some defaults that can be surprising if you're not ready for it. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And then once you have that done, it's time to actually run the tuning and see what your best fit is based on your metric of interest. So in this case, in this example, he's looking at the root mean square error to see which model or which set of parameters of the model fit best. And he's able to locate for each of the model types which particular model. It's got a somewhat ambiguous name of like preprocessor 1, model 09, because it's actually fitting different models for each of these combinations. So it gives it a unique ID on it. But he's not interested in just cherry picking the best fits of these. He wants to use the ensemble technique, which basically is able to take all these model fits, figure out then with some analysis which are the quote good enough parameter sets that then he can use later on in the actual prediction side of it. So taking advantage of the information from all these different model types. And this is a great advancement in tidymodels ecosystem. They have a package called Stacks, which is going to be able to add all, or literally stack together all these different model fits, and then be able to see what is the highest weight in terms of the model giving the best performances, and really get objective measures around that. So then he's got a nice tidy output here of the top 4 members contributing the best prediction outcome, or prediction, I should say, power, you might say. And it is a mix of the light GBM and the Mars model for these different, combinations of the pre-processing and the model fit itself. And then he can take that and feed it just directly into the predict function. That's pretty neat. Just predict this ensemble object that he's created with these stacks, the data set that has the predictor values, and you'll get a tidy data frame with the predicted values back. That, again, another less code solution to get your predictions out of that. And this is a pretty comprehensive start to finish flow on this. And I will say there were some little gotchas along the way that he is able to talk about in the next section of the post. And Mike has a unique perspective on this, our author of the post, because he was an intern to the tidymodels team years ago. So he's had some inside look on this, and that makes his critiques here even more fascinating. So Mike, why don't you take us through that?
Yeah, Mike was an intern back in 2022 on the tidymodels team, and I have to imagine that while that must have given him a huge leg up in converting their legacy code into tidymodels, 2 years in tidymodels time must be like a decade in terms of the amount of new functionality and packages and design choices that have been added to the ecosystem since then. I mean, we have survival analysis in tidymodels now, and that was never on the radar back in 2022, at least as far as I could tell. And as we know, that ecosystem and that universe of packages within tidymodels has grown, and it reminds me a little bit of that recent blog post that we had about creating package universes. And Eric, you and I discussed some of the trade-offs that you have to consider when doing that.
Right.
And it reminds me a little bit about sort of the end of Mike's blog post here, because a lot of these tidymodels packages work together. As Mike notes, there's sort of 3 packages that work together just for hyperparameter tuning itself. The tune package takes care of grid searching. This hard hat developer-oriented package owns sort of the infrastructure around hyperparameter tuning, and then the dials package owns the actual grid construction. And when you think about hyperparameter tuning itself and trying to create these different methods, within each of these packages and having them work together. Well, not only do you have to do that for one type of model, but I'm assuming that you have to create different object-oriented methods for all of these functions across all of these packages for all of the models that tidymodels supports. And I know on the tidymodels homepage, they have sort of a list of all the different modeling algorithms that they support, tree-based, regression-based algorithms, all sorts of different stuff. And there's a ton within that ecosystem that they have supported. But I imagine that once you want to add an additional model type, it's a pretty extensive process to be able to ensure that you can support that model type, not just in one package, but across all of these different packages that work together to create these modeling workflows. So I am not a user of scikit-learn. I'll be honest. I've reviewed some scikit-learn code in the past. I know it's very highly regarded in the Python ecosystem. I don't know this for a fact, but I have to imagine that the tidymodels team must have had the benefit of taking a look at what works well in scikit-learn and what doesn't work well in scikit-learn when they went to sort of move from Caret to tidymodels and create this new framework. So I'd be curious to see if Python sort of suffers from these same sort of issues, or if not, how they're handled in scikit-learn, because I have to agree with Mike that this is somewhat of a pain point if you are doing some pretty hardcore machine learning and predictive modeling, as Mike and his team are clearly doing, right? Creating a lot of different types of models, trying to ensemble them together, trying to tune hyperparameters and do it in a way such that the code is as efficient as possible, right? There's a function in here that I didn't even know existed from the workflow sets package called workflow map, which I have to imagine is like a per-like approach to developing workflows across a bunch of different models, hyperparameter tuning and evaluating and comparing those models, sort of really in this programmatic approach as opposed to hard coding things for each one of these models, and then trying to compare and evaluate the outcome of these models separately. So I would advise you to try to take a look. I don't know how far down in the weeds that we want to go into some of Mike's sort of specific gripes, if you will. I think complaint is sort of a strong word. That's what he uses in the header here. But I think he's really just pointing out, some of the things that you, as a tidymodels user, the deeper you get into it, will face as well, and calling out some of the things that worked for him in terms of workarounds. Some of the things that he learned, is he admits that some of this stuff is straight in the documentation, and some of it is not, and you have to sort of take a lot of time to figure out yourself. He and this is super relatable. I think there is something that was documented in a package here that Mike spent 26 hours trying to figure out before he was able to actually figure out what was going on here, and it had to do, I think, with the defaults in hyperparameter tuning and some of these workflows that were failing extremely slowly, unfortunately, and weren't sort of bringing to light the errors quickly enough to the end user. This is all to say at the end of the blog post that they're still using tidymodels, because I think net at the end of the day, Mike and his team believe that the pros and the benefits that they've received from switching over to tidymodels outweigh the cons. And I think, like anything, within open source software, hopefully some of the complaints and the issues that they faced are things that will be resolved, and over the years we'll move within the tidymodels ecosystem to enhancing these things and making that user experience a little more easy. I've used tidymodels, many times before. Really enjoy it. It's definitely a little bit of a learning curve from Caret. I think you have to have more of a sort of per-like thought process, a higher level design sort of thought process in mind when you're leveraging tidymodels and understanding how all of these different packages like parsnip, rsample, yardstick, work together, workflows to be able to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. But it is super powerful, and I'm glad to see that the team is still sticking with it. And this is like a wealth of information around tidy models and is a great crash course on if you are trying to get into the weeds of machine learning in R, on some of the design choices that Mike and his team made to create these models and evaluate them programmatically. It's fantastic. I'm not sure, Eric, if I've seen a blog post recently that goes into this level of detail within tidy models for us. So very welcome blog post. I think it's a great not only technical discussion, but also sort of practical discussion from a team perspective on what's worked well for them and what hasn't, and where they're planning to go in the future.
I was racking my brain as you were walking through this, and I don't recall one in the recent months or probably even year of anything this comprehensive, because there is a great mix here, again, of one of the points he mentions towards the end is that this, you may think you can kind of hone in on one particular aspect of tidy models, but he's saying that it really took him having this holistic view of how these different pieces fit together. That may be an issue for those that are kind of new to these, suite of packages that have a cohesive API or opinionated way of integrating together. Now, as I say that, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that sure sounds an awful lot like the tidyverse itself, right? I mean, certainly they got inspiration from the tidyverse on a few things. But when I do data processing pipelines with the tidyverse, most of my time is spent with, I'll call a core set of maybe 2 packages, maybe 3 at the most, like dplyr, tidyr, and purr to help with some, mapping processing. Oftentimes, I don't quite have to get into the weeds so much as some of the other packages, but sometimes I do. And so it always helps that as you're building these cases or these use cases for yourself or maybe for your team, to document these intangible kind of learnings that, as comprehensive documentation might be for these given packages, it's how they're integrating together. And certainly the Tidy Models team has done great work to put these freely available, online books online about, all the different ways that Tidy Models can be used. Some, Max Kuhn, Julia Silge, and others have been very front and center with that. And we highly recommend you check out the Tidy Models site to get links to those particular cases. I do think, though, that having a post like what Mike has done here touches on things that, again, are kind of on the more practical side. And I have been victim as someone who uses HPC systems on a weekly basis, oftentimes with jobs that won't complete in a day or sometimes 2 days. It can be costly when you thought you had a default set right, and then you find out after the fact, you forgot to save that prediction result. You forgot to do that one little adjustment to p-values in my case, and whoops, got to go back to it. So there are some things that you can do to help minimize the impact of that, which I don't know works as well for the tidy models, but when we tell people on our team is if you have a simulation pipeline and you want to do like 10,000 simulations, it's going to take a while. You really only want to do a few of them first to make sure you've ironed out all your connections, all your outputs you're saving, so that you're not surprised after running them for that amount of time. So I had the feels when I read that part of Mike's quotes. I've been there many, many times. But these are all things that, again, you kind of have to learn by doing, but then documenting your learning process is so helpful. And I do think there's going to be tremendous value for those that are adopting tidy models to their pipelines right now to kind of see, a literal, real world usage of this and the lessons along the way. I'm confident that the Tidy Models team will take this, hopefully constructive feedback here, and maybe we'll see some enhancements to like these more use case approaches to documentation and not just the developer facing that you might see in the weeds of a package manual or when you go help for like tune or whatnot. You're not really getting the full picture at that point. So maybe we'll see improvements on that. But again, this is the kind of the unofficial contract you sign when you leverage a suite of packages that, again, are meant to be coupled together tightly. There may be cases where the abstraction doesn't give you the full story. You need to kind of get in the weeds a little bit like Micah's done here.
I agree, Eric. And that's a great call out to the Tidy Modeling with R book. I think if you are interested in tidy models or if you're stuck on something, that can be a great resource. We'll put that in the show notes, but it's tmwr.org. Couldn't be easier to get to.
That's right. Yeah, and it should be on your virtual bookshelf or even your printed bookshelf. There is a valuable resource. And again, the ecosystem is always evolving too. There's always, like, I think they do quarterly updates from time to time on the Tidy Models blog. I've seen Max and Email and others, do a great job of writing that up. But yeah, what Mike has done here in this post is tremendous value to the community. We talked about, looking at things from a developer perspective and a user perspective. We're going to put our dev hats on, Mike, a little bit, because we're going to talk about what has been a very, well-spoken or hot topic these days and how that applies to package development workflows. And if you recall, it was maybe a month ago or so, it was kind of quietly put out there, but there is a new IDE authored by Posit called Positron. And again, the geek in me cannot ignore the fact that the name of my favorite movie ever is in the name Positron. So take that for what it's worth. I have visions of the MCP talking to me right now.
End of line.
But in any event, this is really interesting to see the uptake on this. And I dare say we're going to be hearing a lot more about this at PositConf in a week from now. But what we're seeing here is a post from, Stephen Turner, who coincidentally, when I started my R journey many years ago, there were two blogs I discovered that helped me in my journey, especially as coming from another language like SAS, trying to make heads or tails of what R was doing under the hood. Stephen Turner, the author of this post, was one of them, because he wrote this terrific blog called Getting Genetics Done. Just was so instrumental in my learning journey with R, and it is just terrific to see him resurrecting this effort in a new blog. But this post is one of the latest that he's put on this, I believe launched earlier in July. So a huge thank you for Stephen. Even though I don't think I've met you personally, or if I have, it must have been years ago, but you have been very instrumental to my journey with R. So it's terrific to be able to cover one of your posts here in the highlights. Nonetheless, what he talks about in his post here is his early adoption and user experience of Positron to mimic what he's done in the RStudio IDE and before that Emacs of ESS over the years, and that is building an R package. What is the experience like in that space? So we're going to dive into some of his findings here in the highlights now, and first of which is, if you're not familiar with how Positron operates, Positron is actually a fork of the open source version of Visual Studio Code. They call it Code OSS. So when you look at Positron, it's going to look different than the RStudio IDE, but that's by design because it literally is the VS Code shell with Posit's, you might call, design choices on top, to help bring some of that RStudio IDE functionality. Not quite all of it, because this is a beta product, which we'll get to in a little bit. But he puts links to great resources about Positron if you're new to it, such as the wiki on their GitHub repository. Absalon's done a nice intro to Positron, as well as Andrew Heiss, who's been frequently featured on the highlights, his experience of Positron too. So definitely have a look at those after you listen to this. But let's get to the actual package development workflow. So in RStudio, what do we typically do? We like to create a new project in RStudio to help house our package code. And Positron brings their own spin on this as well. This is, again, one of their additions to the top of the Visual Studio Code-like experience, where they let you choose 3 different project types, either a Python project, an R project, or a Jupyter Notebook. So right off the bat, you've got a little wizard to guide you along the way. So, of course, he chooses the R project, and you've got, again, that familiar looking rproj file created for you, which is just like what you would have in RStudio. So there's already a familiar part of your experience. And then how do you actually create a package? Many of us are now using the use this package to create a package from scratch in that same directory. He does that. No gotchas there. He's got the scaffolding right off the bat in the package he's calling hello. And then he puts a simple function called ISay. It's kind of like your hello world type, but just a little sampling of different strings in there. He writes that function. Now we get to some of the differences, because there is a very convenient feature in our Studio IDE that I use every time I make a new function for a package. There is either a keyboard shortcut or a menu entry to dynamically insert an oxygen skeleton of the parameter documentation right there above your function with just a click or a keyboard shortcut away. Unfortunately, that's not in Positron yet, so you're going to have to write out the docs yourself. Of course, it's not too difficult. You'll get code completion, but it is just one of those conveniences that hasn't quite been replicated to the Positron experience yet. But nonetheless, he's able to document his function, and now comes the iteration, right? When you're writing a package, you want to develop your function, you want to test that things are working, update the documentation manual pages dynamically. And what's nice about Positron is you can import a keyboard mapping of shortcuts that will mirror very closely what you might have done in RStudio's keyboard shortcut. So you can import that in optionally, and then you can use that familiar, say, Command-Shift or Control-Shift-D to populate the documentation manual pages on the spot. That works just great here as well. So that's going to take care of, again, the manual pages. They're going to take care of putting the function name in the namespace for exporting, so you don't have to do any manual effort on that front. Just knowing the shortcut or the command palette, you'll be able to do either one of those. Another interesting thing is, from time to time, we like to install the packages in our local environment as we're iterating on it. Before in RStudio, it would call the R command install function verbatim. In Positron, it's actually leveraging the pack package. Pack : local install, which again, I didn't know existed. So little learning there. It's not a surprise that Posit would use some of their tooling of the rlib suite of packages that they have. Excuse me. The rlib suite of packages to help automate some of these processes behind the scenes. So fair play to them. Of course, as you develop a package, you're going to see your fair share of warnings if you need to update like documentation names or other things like that, or the license entry. You get all that in the console just like you would with RStudio. So no surprises there. You can run dev check, get the results there. You can build in your tests with test that very quickly, or use this to launch the test. It's going to open that up right in your IDE. Again, we're seeing a lot of similarities there. There is one other thing that's kind of missing from a development perspective that you might use from time to time, is that for things such as the cover package to help you look at are your test coverage percentage with the functions you develop, there is always a handy add-in, RStudio add-in in the RStudio IDE that will let you kind of run that report quickly with a menu click. As of this recording, Positron's not supporting RStudio add-ins yet. I think that's something that is being worked on, because even in my Visual Studio Code experience with developing R projects, I can get add-ins on that thanks to the efforts of Miles McBain and others from the community. So I think that's on the roadmap, but that's something to be aware of if you want to adopt Positron right away. So from most of the actual workflow, package development looks pretty seamless with Positron. Now, there are some additional things that are missing in the Positron experience that I leverage heavily when I put on my VS Code hat back for a second. That is remote container and the remote connection functionality, meaning that I could have Visual Studio Code on one system, but then have another server either on my local LAN or in my local HPC environment or in the cloud that actually has the R process built into that, and then I can just farm out my computations on that, but look as if it's local. That's not quite there yet in Positron. They are working on that. That would be a game changer for me personally when they adopt that. But what was interesting, what Steven was able to do here, is that little did I know, on top of writing great content about R, he's actually authored a package to help with getting a Docker file built from your package project called PrackPack. Say that 3 times fast. But nonetheless, this is new to me. I've only been familiar with the Docker filer package by our friends at ThinkR. But this looks pretty nifty. He even has a link to the paper about the package as well. We'll put that in the show notes. But he was able to actually, even in Positron, use his PrackPack package to create the Docker file with RM baked in without any fuss. So at least he can get the Docker file going. He just can't do remote container development with that Docker file in Positron. But hey, it's great to see that he's able to get a Docker file on there. So if you want to throw this into another environment and have those same dependencies from both the system level and the R package level ready to go. But he says the experience of that was very smooth because Positron does take advantage of most of VS Code's features, such as syntax highlighting for batch scripting and other file types. So if you're in the multilingual environment, yeah, Positron is definitely going to be a big help to that. So the nutshell to me is that things are looking promising. But again, this is beta. Be warned about that. But I do think that the seeds are planted. And if you want to put on your speculation hat with me, Mike, Stephen kind of has this in a comment in the post. It looks like a lot of the development energy is going to Positron now, so we may have to put a little toast out there to our friendly RStudio IDE, because I don't know if its days are numbered. I guess we'll find out next week. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe we'll find out next week. I know that some folks have raised that question, and the messaging thus far, I think, is that RStudio is going to continue to be supported. Positron's sort of for, there's a lot of different levels of skill of R developers, right? There's R beginners. There's a lot of folks that are probably R intermediate, where they are consumers of R packages, right? And do a lot of their work in ETL stuff and analysis in R, but maybe aren't developing R packages or doing anything, much more hardcore than analysis. I think that's probably a large portion of the R community out there. And, those first two classes, the R developers and the R sort of intermediate folks, or R beginners, I should say, and R consumers mostly. I'm not sure how much incentive they have to move from RStudio. I don't know if Positron feels like a more welcoming environment than RStudio, but I'm super biased because RStudio was probably one of my first ever IDEs. And then I looked at VS Code for a long time. It looked so scary to me when I originally booted it up for the first time and tried to do some work in VS Code. I had no idea where anything was, but it's probably my bias from just being so used to RStudio and the layout there and where the features are. So I don't really know the answer to if someone starts out in RStudio versus starts out in Positron, sort of who is able to make the best progress the quickest. But it would be interesting to see how that plays out, for new users, whether they're migrating directly to Positron or in the future, or whether folks are still starting out with RStudio. But, as you said, Eric, for those of us that need some of these maybe niche features that we get in VS Code, around remote SSH, as you talked about, so that you can work locally or feel like you're working locally while actually, SSH'd into some remote environment, that's pretty powerful. I think that's probably going to come fairly soon to the Positron ecosystem. When I was looking through the issues and the discussions on GitHub, it looks like that one is fairly promising in terms of Posit's ability to actually get that incorporated. The other one sort of that hurts me, that we've talked about before, is the idea of these VS Code dev containers that allow you to develop as if you're in a Docker container, while you're in a containerized environment. That's huge for us in collaboration on our team, but I fully understand that is proprietary Microsoft code, that extension, that VS Code extension. So there's not an easy way for Positron or any other IDE, for that matter, to be able to recreate that unless Microsoft someday decides to actually open source how they go about doing that. So I don't know which one's going to come first, whether Microsoft will open source it or Positron will incorporate it. But that's a big one for me that I would love to be able to see incorporated. But again, these are niche things that for probably the majority of the R community may not necessarily care about. And some of the trade-offs here and the things that we're getting from Positron, I think are huge benefits for potentially a lot of that intermediate class. So it'll be interesting to see, the adoption of Positron, sort of what takes place as it moves from beta to alpha, and what significant changes get incorporated for quality of life for folks. But one of the issues I imagine that Posit is up against is accommodating so many different levels of our users,
yes.
right?
Yes.
It's tricky. So I don't envy, what they're trying to do. It's a large scale problem to solve. But I do think that being able, the fact that VS Code is open source and allows, Posit to sort of tailor it to whatever they want it to be is powerful in and of itself, and I guess another testament to open source. So we'll see how things progress here. I love the fact that folks are starting to dive into it and pick up on the strengths and the weaknesses of it for the rest of us to be able to get up to speed early as we adopt it. So kudos to Stephen as well for doing that.
Absolutely. And one thing I think about is, first, I do want to mention that I've used my fair share of attempts at IDEs before RStudio. They were hit or miss at best. I remember one in particular on the Linux system called RK Ward that tried to do a lot of things, and others tried to make the Eclipse IDE try to fit with our projects. Oh boy, that was gnarly, buddy. If anybody listening remembers that, give me a shout, because I can share stories with you about that. But I knew at that time I was trying to learn it, but as R was starting to take more adoption in industry, it was going to be a tough sell to get people to develop in those kind of IDEs, much less in the command line. I mean, hey, I love command line as much as anybody, but it's not for everybody, right? So when RStudio came out, I mean, you can't underscore the influence it had on not just those getting new to R, new to data science, having this cohesive experience, everything in one place, so to speak, in your development journey. But boy, oh boy, did it help with adoption. It certainly did in my industry. So that's why I'm cautiously optimistic that Positron will eventually, hopefully be tailored in more usability fashion to those use cases for those new to the language and who are not interested in, say, package development. They just want to get their data science done, get their statistics model fits done, get that quarter report out there, and get on your way. Like, I think the bones are there. It's just going to be a little while. But with this soft beta that they rolled out, I think now they're getting... Their issue tracker is quite extensive now, if I last checked. There's a lot on there, so it's a lot for the team to prioritize. But yeah, we shall see. There is one little nugget more on the, speaking of open source, there's always the issue of licensing, right? Little hidden nugget here, and what Stephen mentions at the end here, is I think we should call out here, is that Positron's not using things like GPO, not using Apache. It's using what's called the Elastic License 2.0, which you may have not heard about unless you're really familiar with all the nuts and bolts of software licenses. But let me read the blurb that he calls out here that I think I may know the backstory about, but let me read it first. He says, "You may not provide the software to third parties as a hosted or managed service where the service provider provides users with access to any substantial set of the features or functionality of the software. There have been vendors, I won't name names, that have bundled the open source version of RStudio into their, what I call, platform as a service offerings. And I've heard unofficially, I won't put names on this, that Posit was not too thrilled about this business practice. So it does not surprise me that they would go this next step with this fresh start to put this in there, but that may change where Positron can actually be integrated. So I guess we'll see this space, but that's something to watch out for if you are in that kind of software provider space. So that was a little nugget I didn't expect to see, but we'll stay tuned on that.
Yeah, it's interesting Eric, that's why we have you on the podcast, because you know the backstory around all of this. You have the inside scoop on all of this that I didn't realize, but it is interesting, especially in a lot of environments like the one that Steven works in, where you may need to host something like RStudio server, right? Mostly internally. Maybe you're doing some sort of a consortium collaboration, right? And you want to stand that up in a way that is easily accessible, cloud hosted, something like that, to a group of individuals, maybe internally or externally. So I would love to see this license, like, say something like you're not allowed to resell Positron in that fashion, but if you want to stand it up for free and not make any money off of it, in a similar fashion to how you would stand up RStudio server, then go for it. But this definitely, as Steven mentions in his case, he's not a lawyer, but it looks like Positron's license may preclude the ability to do something like that.
Yeah, that's looking more likely. Maybe again, these will be things we hear about more in between sessions at next week's PositConf. But if you're into this space of those in the data science, platform as a service area, let me just say that if you're a fan of pizza in the U.S., you can probably guess the name of the company I'm thinking about. I'll leave it at that.
I can't say that.
But nonetheless, this was a very comprehensive post by Steven here. And again, it's a pleasure to have him on the highlights. And I'm really looking forward to see how he continues to use Positron and other efforts like this, as I'll be testing the waters a little bit in my continued Shiny development. There is one thing that I want to have that hopefully I can talk to the Posit folks next week about. Please make a Nix package for Positron. Please. Then I'm happy.
Hey, it's open source. Pull requests are welcome.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if Bruno, you're listening. Maybe we need to talk about. Maybe we need to strengthen numbers on this one.
There you go.
Well, strength in numbers is also a way you can say, what's the benefit of our weekly itself? It is the strength of the community that populates every single issue. So we'll take a couple minutes to talk about our additional finds here. Now, I'm going to talk about something I totally did not expect to talk about, especially in the circle I operate in. We have a new package that's been released in the R ecosystem called Maestro, positioned to create and orchestrate data pipelines in R. I know a little bit about pipelines because I happen to work closely with the author of Targets himself, Will Landau. So, of course, the first thing I'm thinking of is, what is Maestro all about? So we'll put a link to this in the show notes, of course, but at a high level, Maestro is definitely positioning itself in the realm of data processing. I don't envision it's trying to encroach on the comprehensive ability of Targets to be flexible in many types of analytical workflows that we often see in data science and operational and automation efforts. But the nuts and bolts of Maestro are kind of fascinating, where they're taking advantage of our oxygen tags in a function that you create for your data processing or your ETL processing to define characteristics such as the schedule of when the pipeline will run, such as like the frequency, what's the actual start time of that job, and there are other decorators as well. And then once you have your functions decorated, you use some of the functions built into Maestro to build that schedule and then to execute it. So they do leverage other packages that help with, you might say, more of the high demand, computation, such as the future package and the fur package. You want to have that map-like functionality for your running schedule. It looks like it can interface with those quite a bit. But I don't think this is an either or. I definitely, when I saw Maestro get mentioned, I went immediately to their package site, and they have an article on their motivation for creating Maestro. And of course, there was a section on comparison of other packages. I was pleased that they talked about targets on this, because that was going to be something I would have reached out to the authors right away about if I hadn't seen this. But it looks like they are interested in seeing where Maestro and targets can complement each other, because at least in some of the target critiques I've heard over the years, it's a little more difficult for these more ETL, especially the extract portion of data processing pipelines. Again, especially if you're interfacing with databases or APIs that you're ingesting data from. There are ways you can use targets with it. You just have to get a little more into the nuts and bolts of how you orchestrate your return objects and whatnot. So I'll be very interested to see if this ends up being a cohesive relationship or not. But with that said, if you're in this space of producing comprehensive data pipelines, Maestro may be worth a look.
Absolutely, Eric. I'm very interested to see how that evolves. That sort of came out of left field for me. That Maestro package wasn't something that I had on my radar, but it's really, really interesting. Especially as we've been getting into a lot more targets projects lately, a lot more of these sort of pipeline types of projects. So it'll be a potential new tool in our tool belt as well. I have sort of a different highlight that I wanted to call out. It is an interview with the R Consortium published and held with Pharma Rug China organizer Joe Zhu, who spoke with the R Consortium about how he has grown the R community in China, specifically in the pharma space. I think it's something that we don't necessarily talk about enough, is how international R is. A couple cool facts about Joe is that he has his PhD in statistics, where he studied in New Zealand, which we know is the birthplace of R. Absolutely. He worked at Roche for the past 4 years, where he helped open source 30 software packages. There's 4 that are called out here. I'm not super familiar with them, Eric, but you might be, being in the pharma ecosystem. Formatters, R tables, R listings, and Turn.
Oh, yes.
TERN. But it sounds like there's many more beyond that. This R community in China has done a lot of collaboration, and I think is involved pretty heavily in the Pharma R user group, sort of in general. And there's just a lot of great talks about how Joe has helped organize a lot of events, a lot of hybrid events, and how he's been able to pull those off using Microsoft Teams, as well as hosting these hybrid events in person as well. So I thought it was a really nice interview for anyone who's looking to learn about organizing R groups within their neck of the woods. That you might get something out of this interview.
Yeah, I'm really glad to see this, because we are seeing a lot more momentum of our colleagues in Asia Pacific regions adopting R in life sciences. This is hugely instrumental to making that journey hopefully easier for those that are on this. And, very closely related to this, some of I'm one of the organizers of the annual R Pharma virtual conference. One thing that we've always struggled with is how do we best accommodate our fine friends over in the Asia Pacific region, because we're mostly a US-based conference in terms of time zones and the way we stream our talks. Well, I'm happy to say that, alongside reading this post, if you are in the Asia Pacific region, there is going to be an R Pharma specific event tailored to Asia Pacific. So we're going to have a link to that. It's actually in this week's R Weekly issue. The call for talks is open for that particular effort. We'll put that in the show notes just in case here too. Jonathan Carroll has actually been quite nice to advertise that on Mastodon and whatnot. So yeah, this is a wonderful time if you're in the life sciences space in the Asia Pacific region to dive into this momentum. I liken it to what we, when R Pharma was first introduced in 2018. None of that had been built before. Now we're trying to expand the scope of this, because we want to take advantage and give everybody across the world a unique opportunity to share their learning and learn from each other along the way. So yeah, gratifying to see the R Consortium keep on spotlighting these great use cases. And yeah, I'm very excited to see where the future goes here. And of course, you can't just be excited about that. You got to be excited about the rest of the issue. There is a boatload of additional content here following the full gamut of new packages, many of which we wish we could talk about here today, but there's only so much time in a day. but there's lots of great tutorials as well. I see a full gamut of spatial visualizations, tidyverse pipelines, even a great post by Nicola about creating typewriter styled images. I think that's great for my retro feels as well. Love to see that. So much more content there. Where do you go for it? If you don't know by now, you know now. It's rweekly.org. You bookmark that every single week. We got a new issue for you. And if you want to contribute to the project, we rely on your contributions in the community. So please, if you find that great new blog post, maybe you wrote that post, you find a great package, a great tutorial, send that to us via a pull request directly linked at the top right corner of the home page. It's all marked down all the time, right? Markdown is how I live and writing my content. And as for some internal presentations having to go back to PowerPoint, it just doesn't feel right. I feel right writing a markdown in Quarto or R Markdown, and I'm going to put my foot down on that. Hopefully that becomes more of a trend in my industry. But I digress. Either way, all markdown all the time, so you can send your pull request right there. We'll be glad to merge that in for the week. And also, we love to hear from you as well. We got a contact page in this podcast episode show notes, directly linked there. Did a little HTML hacking to get that together after we moved our podcast hosting, so hopefully it works out for you. But also, you can get in touch with us on social media. I am on Mastodon these days at our podcast, at podcastindex.social. Also on LinkedIn, send me a shout there. And again, if you're going to be at PosiConf, I will be there at this time next week for sure. So we hopefully hear from you. And Mike, where can the listeners get a hold of you?
You can find me on Mastodon at Mike_Thomas at fosstodon.org. You can find me on LinkedIn just by searching Ketchbrook Analytics, KETCHBROOK, to see what I'm up to lately. Or, Eric, as you said, find me in person next week if you're going to be in Seattle. We'd love to chat with you.
Yep, I'm going to do my best to wear some kind of R-related swag shirt every single day so I'm easy to spot. But who knows, maybe everybody wearing R swag, so it may not be easy to spot.
I'm going to print up some R Weekly Highlights podcast T-shirts for us.
Oh,
because
yeah.
This is an audio podcast. People might not have a single clue what I look like.
Yeah, I still remember one time at the first Shiny Dev conference, I was spending a question. Somebody looked over and said, "Hey, I know that voice." Yeah, so we're going to get, I'm sure, our fair share of that. Nonetheless, we could blabber on all day. We're always excited to talk about this stuff, but we got to close up shop here. We got our day jobs to get back to, but we're very happy you joined us today for listening to this latest episode of our Weekly Highlights. And again, we will not be back next week because we'll be at PosiConf, but we look forward to connecting with you all again with a new episode in 2 weeks from now. So until then, goodbye, everybody.